Well, good morning and welcome. Good morning to those in the room. Good morning to those of you joining us online. Welcome to St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Meredith Ward. I serve as the Associate Rector for Pastoral Care here at St. Bart's. And on behalf of all of us, it is my joy and delight to welcome you here this morning to the forum where each Sunday we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. This morning we are delighted to have with us for the last of Molly's three-part series on what healing looks like, conversations on suffering, death, and medical care. We are delighted to have Rabbi Mychal Springer, manager of Clinical Pastoral Education at NY-Presbyterian Hospital, who is here to explain how hospital chaplains are educated and trained. Very important topic, especially if you've ever been in the hospital. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly.
Thanks, Meredith. First of all, I am so incredibly just grateful to my dear friend Mychal, who is one of the most respected pastoral theologians and teachers. She is somebody who is widely known here in New York and widely known really in the country, and has written several books on this subject. And it's just a great honor to have her here. In fact, the arc of these conversations happened kind of amazingly. We had an ethics conversation to start, medical ethics, pretty standard, sort of like setting the stage for what we're looking at when we're talking about biomedical ethics. And then we had Dr. Bob Klitzman last week talking a little bit about that intersectionality between spirituality and whole person healing in the hospital from an ethicist and from the point of view of somebody who is a doctor in that space, a psychiatrist. And now we have Mychal here to talk about how this training works, how the deep listening of spiritual care happens in the hospital. It doesn't just happen because you're a good listener, and you'll hear why. I want to just say, just to talk for 1 minute about my journey and how I got to Mychal, because in about 2010, I found myself sitting in her office at Jewish Theological Seminary, where she was a professor of pastoral theology, and I had been sort of on a little bit of a walkabout myself. My own mother died in 2003, and I was working in a space that I was no longer really that filled with and interested in, and I had begun to think, how can I get back into that space of asking those big questions that we're asking when we lose somebody that we love very, very much? And how do I do that in a better, more comprehensive way? So I started volunteering for VNS as a volunteer, hospice volunteer, and I thought, this is wonderful and this is sacred work, and I want to do more, and I need to figure out how to professionalize or how to engage this more deeply. And thus began my very circuitous walk, which I won't bore you with, but it landed me into Mychal's office in 2010, I think. And Mychal was running a hospice unit of clinical pastoral education, and we'll talk about what that means. And I said, well, what is CPE, clinical pastoral education? And she said, you're going to love it, and you're going to love my hospice unit. And there were, I think, 8 of us in that unit, and it was, Christian, non-denominational, Jewish. I can't remember. It was a very mixed group of students, and it was absolutely transformative to my life. And so with that, I introduce you to Mychal. And I guess what I'd like to do is open up with a very big question and let her just talk about it. How'd you get into the work?
Great question. Now I'm on. You hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So first of all, thank you, Meredith, for the introduction, and thank you, Molly. What a blessing to have you walk into my life all those years ago, and here we are. I love that. So I went to rabbinical school. Rabbinical school is a 5-year program. And I knew from the time I was bat mitzvah age, 12, 13, that I wanted to be a rabbi. And I went to rabbinical school and I started learning a lot of stuff. And paradoxically, the more I learned, the less secure I felt in my faith. And by the time I was in my 4th year of rabbinical school, I was pretty agnostic in a very, very painful way. You can imagine I've had this hope and dream for many years, and I had really lost my way. I was depressed. I don't know which was which, the faith crisis, the depression, the two intermingled, and I sought out a mentor of mine, Dr. Sam Klagsbrun, Aleva Shalom, peace be upon him. Sam died about 6 months ago. And I said to Sam, I don't really know what I will do as a rabbi. I had always thought that being a rabbi would enable me to help people, and I don't know anymore what kind of help I can offer. I don't even have a faith that I can draw on in a robust way. And my thought was to leave rabbinical school actually and to become a doctor, although that felt not quite right, but that seemed concrete enough that that would be a way that I knew that I'd be helping people. And Sam said to me, why don't you do a unit of Clinical Pastoral Education, CPE, at Memorial Sloan Kettering? And I had never heard of CPE. I had actually thought about going to Memorial Sloan Kettering a few years earlier to do an internship program there that wasn't CPE. And so it had a kind of logic to it, and I said, okay, I'll try that. So I did my first unit of CPE at Memorial Sloan Kettering with Sister Teresa Brophy, who was from New Zealand, a Catholic nun. And what was amazing to me about doing this unit of CPE is that I didn't have to pretend to have a faith that I didn't have. That was really important, because that was what was so harmful to me in being in rabbinical school and feeling frozen into trying to meet other people's expectations of what my spiritual life looked like. And there was something about being in the hospital and being face to face with people who were struggling with their own lives, with their faith. There was no room to pretend, and there was no reason why one needed to pretend. And I covered 2 units. One of them was an ovarian cancer unit, and I met a lot of women much younger than I am now, but older than I was then, who were living and dying of ovarian cancer. And there was something that happened in the combination of being face-to-face with people who were seeking comfort in the face of dying, and then bringing that into supervision with Teresa and my CPE group, and being able to talk about what was happening. And one of the questions that we are often asked when we bring in case material in CPE is, was God in the room? Kind of interesting question. And given that I had become so agnostic, I just didn't feel that I could say anything about God, but I found that I was able to say something about my experience of God's presence. And that surprised me. And that experience opened up something that had become closed. And in the opening, I felt tremendous relief and curiosity and possibilities. So I decided to do more CPE, and I did a residency, which is a full year, with no intention of becoming a chaplain, just because it was more life-giving than anything I'd ever done. Again, paradoxically, because a lot of the people I worked with died, so how is it that death is life-giving? That was also part of what I was curious about. And in the course of my residency, I realized that in addition to loving the way that being in the hospital room was opening, I really loved the education that offered this amazing invitation to explore and be real and come together with people who are suffering and not put my own suffering away, but allow it to have a place at the table, not in a way that would detract from the people that I was caring for, but actually as my own foundation that I could draw on in knowing how to be with somebody else who was examining their life.
Thank you. I guess what you've touched on a lot of things, and I think it's important. I mean, we live in this world of CPE. We live in this world of understanding what these concepts are, what it is to be, you know, a board certified chaplain. But maybe you can talk a little bit about the nuts and the bolts of what a CPE unit looks like with you, or supervision looks like. What does it feel like? It's a two-part question. What does it feel like to be in supervision, you know, and also what are the expectations and just nuts and bolts requirements eventually to become a board certified chaplain?
So in order to become a board certified chaplain, a person needs to have an MDiv or the equivalent, a theological degree, and endorsement from a faith group that says, yes, you're part of us. And 4 units of clinical pastoral education. So each unit of clinical pastoral education is 400 hours. And of the 400 hours, at least 100 are educational hours and 300 or so are clinical hours. We just started a part-time program. We have part-time programs and full-time programs, and we have starter programs and residencies. When Molly came to me, she joined a part-time program, and the part-time program is really great for people who work, for people who are older and are interested in discovering what this world is all about. And often, the people who come to us for the part-time program don't have the master's level degree. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And often it's people who are really attracted to this work and want to see what it's like before they figure out what the rest of the education would look like. And we support them in that. So for some of our students, when they start and they begin to visit patients, there's this question of, well, what authority do I have to visit a patient, to call myself chaplain intern, to show up in the room? And that question is actually really important for starting, because the method of CPE is an action, reflection, refined action model. And you are learning to do what you don't yet know how to do, which means that you go into the room in that place of not knowing. And supervision is support for you in learning from what you do know to what you don't know. CPE, we have a lot of outcomes that we're working towards. But because of the model of education, we don't begin with frontal education. You can get that at seminary. We begin with enough information that we are confident that you're not going to harm anybody, and you need to know the policies and procedures, and you need to know that if something is going wrong, you say, excuse me, I have to leave now, and you get some help. But for a lot of people coming into the room, it's about making yourself available for an encounter with somebody. Often it's about conversation. And we utilize what we know from being in conversation with lots of different people to learn ways of going deeper and deeper. So by the time you get to board certification, you have a lot of skills that you've learned that teach you how to care for people in lots of different circumstances and how to have interventions that are effective for supporting people in their spiritual lives when they're in crisis. But the starting place is really drawing on one's own habits of being and making yourself available to be in relationship and seeing what emerges and committing yourself to reflecting on what emerges, which means that in order to become a board-certified chaplain, you have to be able to fail. If you're so worried about getting it right, you can't walk in the room. But if it's okay with you that you'll see where you are, and then you'll learn from that what's possible, then you can be in a program like CPE, and you can move towards being a practitioner, because as practitioners, even when we're certified, we're always surprised. There are always things that happen that we never expected. And we have to have the skills to reflect on what just happened, and what do I know that I can draw on and reconfigure in a new way to be applicable in this moment for this unique human being.
That's great. I think, I know that for me, one of the things that was something I needed to work with and be observant to and watch myself being in the room was a mother, a fixer, a solver, which is really not necessarily helpful to a patient. That's not what I'm there to do. I'm not there to fix something. And I had to learn that. I had to learn that in 4 units of CPE. I had to learn that over and over again in ways that were always a little bit surprising. For me, that the ability to observe myself in the room was much of what I had to learn. What am I doing in here right now? What is happening here? How can I sort of be available and not lean into that thing that I want to do, which is just scoop up this person and fix the problem, or climb into bed with them and hold them, right? I could have that as a place of desire, but that's obviously not something I'm going to do. And it's probably not what's helpful right now. So everybody, I had a unit once with a woman who had become a sister, actually a Catholic sister, after being a NICU nurse practitioner for 30 years. And her challenge was not going up to the machines and taking a look at the numbers. I mean, we all come into this work with ourselves. So I think, yes, observing that in ourselves. So you are a supervisor. You are a CPE supervisor. That is a next level. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what your day looks like and how you became a CPE supervisor. It's another level of accreditation.
So for many years, I was certified as a CPE supervisor, and for many years that was the language that we used. A few years ago, because of our relationship to the Department of Education, we became CPE educators, which is kind of funny. So my old supervisor, Paul Stenke, who was a Lutheran minister, he loved to say the word supervisor. And my first student, I was terrified. It's the same model that goes into becoming a chaplain, goes into becoming an educator. And my first student would call, most of the education that we do is in groups, which I love. And students get 1 session a week, 45 minutes a week, of individual supervision. And this student, who was older than me and much more experienced in the world, she would call it snoopervision. So, part of being an educator is dealing with the feelings that we all have, whatever those are, about authority. And there's something about religious life that is very connected to authority because we're in the realm of the divine and divine authority, and what does it mean to be in a world. And one theological stance is that to have a world, there is a maker. But when we encounter all of the chaos of the world, we can often feel confused about the nature of the maker and how we encounter that maker. So one of the principles for CPE education is that there's a through line between patients and chaplains, chaplains and educators, educators and the divine. And when we are working on our relationship with the person who's in charge of us, we are working on questions of meaning and cosmos in the face of chaos. So my work, my day-to-day work, I work with residents who are with me for a year. They come from all different faith backgrounds, which is one of the things that I love about doing my work. And I think about CPE as a place where we practice peace because we make room for difference and conflict. And it's the place that I have the greatest confidence that we can overcome what tears us apart because we set up a context in which we can talk to one another. So I spend 2 full days a week with my residents. They present the material from their visits, just like I presented the material of my visits when I was beginning and through my training. And it's a beautiful tapestry because one of my spiritual principles is that God gives us the patience that we need, which means that Molly saw a lot of people who needed her to be mother in one way or another. And I saw a lot of people who were in faith crisis. So one of my early patients was a woman who said to me, "I want to pray, and I don't know how. Will you pray with me?" And I said to her, "I don't know how either, but maybe we'll figure it out together." And we did. And those experiences of praying with her have continued to be very present to me throughout my life. So as an educator, I am always curious about what material will show up when my students present. And we look at the visit through multiple lenses. So we have a whole curriculum with different outcomes that we're looking at. We look at students' narrative histories and the ways that those show up in the visit. We look at social location. We look at skills that people are bringing. We look at justice issues and bias. We look at people's capacity to receive feedback, which is actually so important for being this reflective practitioner. And a lot of the learning that we do, as I said before, is in groups. So when, let's say, a resident is bringing a case, it's not that I'm doing all this teaching. Everybody around the room is sharing what they know from their experience. And each resident presents a learning contract so that we get to know what the person names for themselves as they're learning. So learning contracts come out of adult learning theory. But Donald Schoen, who was somebody who wrote a book called Educating the Reflective Practitioner, and reflective practice was his specialty, he talks about how when we create a learning contract, when we set out goals for ourselves, we articulate what we don't yet know. So it's a leap into the unknown. And that's what happens with each verbatim. We ask people not just to, that verbatim is what we call the cases that people bring. They capture what happened in the visit and then begin to reflect on it through the prism of all of these different outcomes. And they're able to articulate what they know and what they want to learn. What do they not yet know? And when people ask me, what do you do? If I'm being honest, which usually I don't bother because we don't have this kind of a forum, but what I do is explore verbatims. That's the heart and guts of what I do, which is to say that I help people look at what happens for them when they enter into the room and extend themselves to offer care. What is the care that they are able to offer? What should we understand about it? What do we understand about they themselves as somebody who is offering this care? What is happening inside of them? So it's not just the words on the page, but it's the reflection afterwards that says, I went into this room and I was really scared. And what were you scared of? What was terrifying? Maybe it was the challenge that the patient offered when the patient was mad at God. Maybe that was the challenge. Maybe it was the distance between the affect, the patient seeming so angry, but saying everything's fine with a big, brittle smile. And what does that tap into for the chaplain, the resident who's learning? Where are those places where you have an opportunity to grow? What are the spiritual and theological dimensions of the visit? What are the frames of reference that the residents or interns bring to this encounter? And through being seen and known, we help the person go into the next visit. Some of it is kind of logical. We addressed this topic, and therefore you have more knowledge about how to do that. And some of it is mystical, that the student talks about feeling stuck, and we stay in the stuckness, and we don't resolve it, we don't fix it. And yet the next time the person walks in the room, it feels a little bit different, and something more is possible. And then comes the next iteration, which gets brought back to the group. And then lo and behold, there's the next thing that we need to learn together. And the process itself has a sacred quality. That's what I do.
Yeah, no, I thank you. I mean, it's so beautiful and it's so beautifully said. And I think that piece, that sacred quality in between the lines of a verbatim in that learning is where God is. It is where the Holy Spirit is moving us into deeper territory with a patient and breaking open something that is that's inhibiting, I think, for the patient, which I think is the beautiful work. I want to be able to ask questions. I mean, have the audience ask questions. But while you're coming up with questions and while Meredith is coming up, I do have.
I'll just quickly invite people who are in the room. If you have questions for Mychal or Molly, Kate DiTullio is in the room with question cards. So just put your hand up, and she will bring you a card and bring it up. And if you're joining us online, you can put your questions in the chat or in the comments section, or you can email me directly at mward@stbarts.org. So while we're waiting for those questions to come in, please proceed.
Mychal, in your sort of experience for all these years of teaching students, what makes a particularly good learner? I think you've touched on some of the qualities, and what inhibits? It inhibits the learner. Yeah.
So my first, well, not first, but very formative educator, Paul Stenke, who died a year and a half ago and was a Lutheran minister. Paul would say, don't hide your mistakes under a bushel. And the impulse when we feel we've done something wrong, to say, I need to share it. My desire to learn is greater than my desire to look good. That's what makes a great learner, in all places, really. Precisely the things that we wish nobody would know about are the things that we have to talk about. That's how we learn. So what we work very hard to create in CPE is an environment that lowers shame and invites exploration. And I talked before about authority. Some of the work is in dismantling the fear of authority, the fear of being punished. And what's so interesting about CPE is that fear of being punished is both in our human relationships and in our relationship with the divine. It's been interesting for me to learn how many Christians walk around with a fear of a punishing God. And I know that in my own life, I've had to overcome a fear of a punishing God and discover a God of love. And Christians talk much more freely about a God of love. There's certainly a God of love in Judaism, but maybe in our history of wanting to differentiate from Christians, we've downplayed a God of love to our detriment. And so discovering that there is love and compassion in the face of failure is so important for people as they're reflecting on their lives in crisis, and for chaplains as they're working to learn how to do this, and for us as educators. So I'd say that's the greatest quality. And what gets in our way is wanting to prove that we're there already. The less we have to prove, the more we can flourish.
For life.
Yeah.
Yes, not just in the hospital room. There's a question here, which is, it's sort of, both these questions are similar. Do you think that the academy, JTS, Union, wherever, we have in the city, but the Academy for Theology, do you think the question is, does it kill the spiritual and mystical? Does it tap it down? Does it allow for space, or is it all about what you should think and what you should believe?
It doesn't have to. I think that my greatest problem when I was in rabbinical school is that I didn't know how to talk about what was happening in me. I tried. I had some wonderful mentors, and I would go to them and I would try to talk to them. And I really did the best that I could. I would, it's okay. I would make appointments, and I would have these conversations, and it would help, but there was still more. And when I went to CPE, and I would have the group and individual supervision with Teresa, there was a quality of listening that sometimes we talk about listening into speech, right? That process listened me into speech in a way that I didn't know I needed, and got me in touch with my crisis in a way that wasn't shameful, but really was the crisis of being a spiritual being in a broken world. And I found so much relief there. And what happened was that pretty soon after I had started my own CPE journey, I began the supervision process, and I started having students from the seminaries, Union Theological Seminary, General Theological Seminary, Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew Union College, the New York seminaries. And they would come to me, and I would do with them what had been done with me. It wasn't like I was inventing it. I was just passing it along. It was this incredible gift that I had received. And pretty soon I got a call from Jewish Theological Seminary, where I had been ordained, and they said, well, will you come teach here? And a few years later, after I had begun teaching, I got a call and they said, would you be associate dean? And it turned out that my students who had come to me in the hospital to learn what I knew how to do as a CPE educator had gone back to the seminary and said, this is what we need here. This is the best thing that I've received here. You need to bring Mychal here. Now, it wasn't the best thing because it was me. It was the best thing because it was CPE, because it was a different kind of listening. And in my years of being associate dean at the rabbinical school, I said, you know, what we really need is a CPE program here to shift the culture. So I created the Center for Pastoral Education, and that's where Molly came to me. And Molly has been an incredible friend in the center. The center still exists. I'm no longer there. But the creation of the center and a CPE program at Union Theological Seminary across the street was part of saying we need to have spaces that listen to our students in a particular way that fosters their well-being, understanding that it's tremendously stressful to imagine oneself into a place of religious leadership, and we need to attend to them intimately and fully.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for those of you who don't know, CPE is now one unit of CPE is now a requirement for most seminaries to graduate. So 400 hours, and you can do it in any way. Usually seminarians will do that in the summertime for a full summer to do those hours then. It's a very, very important part. And then there are people who, of course, I did. I became an ordained priest only recently. It was the next part of my journey. For me, being a chaplain was the first place that I went when I went to seminary. That was the desire. So there are people who go to seminary who actually are really called to that work as opposed to ordained ministry, and we see that a lot as well. So I have a question here about the cross-pollination of different faith groups, people who come to you who are rabbinical students or rabbis or ministers or students in different, there are humanists now who are endorsed by humanist organizations. That we have a humanist program, a person who's running all of spiritual care up at Columbia. So Harvard has a humanist chaplain. How do you teach students to go into a room from a very different faith into another faith's room, patient's room?
So we value cultural humility, and one of the nice things about having a group is that we have people in the group of different faith backgrounds, and they can engage with one another and learn quite a lot from one another. We don't want to be in a position where we go into the room of a patient who's of a faith that we don't have any experience with, and we say to them, teach me, because I don't know anything. That's not so reassuring. We should know some basics, and we're also going to get to know a lot more of the uniqueness of people when we're caring for them and not making assumptions. So there's quite a lot of information about different faith groups that's available to us, a lot on the internet that's available to us. And in order to be a good chaplain, you have to really have love and appreciation for difference and an ability to grapple with challenges. So obviously we're in the middle of war, and there's a lot of tension in our world that is grounded in religious difference, and we have to find ways of being real with one another and opening up pathways for connection and healing. So that we need it in the world at large. We need it as chaplains in the hospital. We need it as spiritual providers. And those are the qualities that we cultivate in our program, really learning how to listen, not becoming defensive, and bringing that curiosity in a non-invasive way that encourages people to make known what it is that they need spiritually, and doing our best to be able to provide it either ourselves or in collaboration with other providers who are of that faith tradition.
Absolutely. I've often thought that if we could get world leaders into a CPE program, we would be in better shape. CPE is a great connector, and I think I said one of the most moving experiences I've had recently was being in a room of 70 chaplains from NY-Presbyterian's system of all faiths, all different social locations, all different cultural backgrounds, knowing that all of us have had the training to be able to speak to one another in a way that is respectful, curious, open, and deeply connecting. And it's just amazing to be among colleagues like that in that space. We have a question here. How does a CPE program intersect with residents and doctors?
At our hospital, we created something called Partners in Healing, which is a fellows circle for palliative and geriatrics fellows, doctors, and our chaplain residents. They spend 4 mornings together in the course of the year learning about spirituality and palliative care, and talking to one another about suffering and death and spiritual needs that people have as practitioners, medical practitioners and spiritual care providers. And I love this program. We created it because too often the worlds exist side by side, but not enough in dialogue. And we've found in these cohorts that people are feeling empowered and connected in new ways. When we got to the end of the 4th session last year, one of the doctors said to me, "I've been waiting for this day from the beginning of my training." It was an incredible statement. And for the chaplain residents, seeing them feel like, oh, my voice is wanted here in the hospital. We don't bill for chaplain services the way that we bill for other services, and it creates a different dynamic. But the chaplains have to learn to be known, and that when we invite people to engage with us, that people will take us up on that invitation. So I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. There was a world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon named Fred Epstein, and he's no longer alive. I love Fred a lot, and he taught me a lot. And I was at Beth Israel when he came and created something that was called the Institute for Neurology and Neurosurgery, that no longer exists, at what used to be Doctors Hospital, and then became the Singer Division, and then was turned into condominiums.
It's the story of New York. Yeah.
So when Fred came, he said, "We need to have a prayer service on our unit, a weekly prayer service." I said, "Okay. And who's going to come to this service?" And he said, "Everyone." I said, "Who's everyone?" He said, "The doctors, the nurses, the physical therapists, the child life specialists, the social workers, environmental services. Everybody's going to come." I said, "Okay." I said, "Are you going to come?" And he said, "Yes." And he did come sometimes. And it was a beautiful service. And the families, the patients, they all came. It was really beautiful. So one day, there was a little kid, and he was about to go in for brain surgery for a recurrence of a tumor that he had. And I went to his parents, and I said, "Do you want to pray?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "Do you want me to see if Fred would pray with us? Would you like Fred to pray with us?" And they said, "Oh, he won't want to pray with us." I said, "Okay, let me see." So I went to Fred's office, and I said, "Fred, I know you're about to go in and do this surgery, and would you come and pray with us? And he said, they're not going to want to pray. I said, yeah, they would. So I brought Fred with me, and we were in the ICU room, and we all held hands, and we prayed for this little boy. And one of the things that we prayed for was over Fred's hands, that his hands should be guided by God to remove every last bit of this tumor. And I got an email the other day. This took place many, many years ago. I got an email the other day from the parents of this little boy, and they told me two things. One, he's getting married. And the other, that they remember that prayer, and it has stayed with them for all those years.
I think we should end on that. Please join me in thanking Rabbi Mychal Springer for her wise words and her work, her ongoing work. Thank you, Mychal. Yep.
Mychal, Molly, thank you both so much for this incredible introduction to what it means to be a chaplain in a hospital. And you all should know that all of your clergy have undergone this training in some form or another. And it is daunting, and it is intense, and it is also some of the best training that I'll speak for myself, that I received during my years in seminary. It is a sacred calling. So thank you for being with us. We are about to begin our 11 o'clock service, where we will have the Duraflay Requiem being performed as part of the Mass. So I hope you'll join us either online or in person. And next week at the Forum, we will welcome the Right Reverend Mark Eddington, who is Bishop in charge of the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe. Did you know there was a Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Europe? There is. And he will come and speak about the presence of the Episcopal Church outside of the United States. So I hope you'll join us then. And thank you so much for being with us.